Every day, scientists are learning more and more about how human brains work and how many of us don't fit into the old-fashioned understanding of how brains should work. But a lot of ideas about parenting and familial relationships still need to catch up to the reality of human variation. Neurological differences are natural, profoundly valuable parts of being in a community together and in being part of a family. Whoever you are, wherever you are in your journey, I am here to explore with you. We are all in this together. Welcome to Neurodiverging. Hello, and welcome back to the Neurodiverging podcast. I'm Danielle Sullivan, and I'm so happy to be back here with you after our recent break. I've got a lot of great shows coming at you in the next couple of months, so please click subscribe if you haven't yet to make sure you don't miss any episodes, and find show notes and more at neurodiverging.com. To welcome us back, today's conversation is with Laura Reber, founder of Progress Parade, an online special education tutoring company. With her lifelong interest in psychology and problem solving, Laura initially began her career as a school psychologist before following her passion for supporting each student as an individual to create her tutoring company, Progress Parade. Laura is a wealth of knowledge about special education, learning disabilities and challenges, and how to navigate the public education system to get the most for your child. In this interview, we're discussing what a school psychologist does, the difference between how a school evaluates a child and how a medical team does, how a child's diagnosis can impact the services they receive at school, and the rights of the parent around school evaluation. We're also talking about some common supports a school can offer to a neurodivergent child. I learned a ton from this interview, and I hope you do too. Want special access to the patrons-only after show and many other members-only perks? Consider pledging $1, $5, or $10 a month to fund the Neurodiverging podcast. Find out more and pledge today at patreon.com/neurodiverging. Thank you for your support, and here's our interview. Welcome to Neurodiverging, Laura. It's great to meet you. How are you doing today?
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me. I'm doing well.
I'm so glad you're here. So you are a school psychologist. Now you tutor special education and other kids with additional needs outside of the average school system. And can you let us know a little bit about how you began to specialize in tutoring students with learning disabilities especially?
Of course. Yeah. So I was working as a school psychologist in the school setting, in a public school setting. And I just repeatedly saw that it was really tough to really meet diverse learners' needs in the school setting. I think one great way to do that is one-on-one. And so when I was thinking about other things I could do outside of the school setting, I realized that in graduate school, my number one passion was always what we called the academic intervention clinic at grad school, or tutoring, essentially high quality tutoring. So I started tutoring on my own outside of my school-based job, after school and before school, and loved it so much that I decided to make a career out of it. It was exciting.
Awesome. So you really are a kind of passion driven to this.
Yeah, for sure.
And what originally got you into psychology?
So I originally got into psychology, I think, because I was thinking about this recently, like, what? This feels like so long ago. Where did I get into psychology? I come from a family of math and science people, like just a whole lineage of engineers and statisticians. And I like science, but I also was always drawn to like helping people too. So I was like, what's the like science plus helping people? And I think that's how I was originally drawn to studying psychology in undergraduate. And I did also study computer science in undergraduate too. So I kind of got to see, the science from both ways. Like, what is human psychology like? And what does automation look like too? It was interesting to kind of see both lenses.
It's really cool. It sounds really interesting to be comparing those. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then what about school psychology specifically? Because that is kind of a very specific niche.
It's very specific. And I actually don't think I realized how specific it was when I started studying it.
Yeah.
I was working after I studied psychology, I was working in foster care. So I was a foster care case manager, and I knew that wasn't my long-term career path for many reasons. So when I was thinking about what's my next step, obviously in foster care, there's a lot of at-risk kids, a lot of students who are experiencing various kinds of at-risk factors, like not only learning disabilities and IEPs, but socioeconomic factors, and obviously home factors are huge for students in foster care. Continuity and things like that. Either their lived experience is a huge part of what they're going through. So I was like, how can I reach these students the best? Like, and I thought, well, they're at school all day. Most students do attend school. So it's a great kind of place to meet students where they're at. And for some students, it's the most consistent environment they're in. If they are, for example, foster students might change their home environment a lot, but sometimes they are able to stay in the same school setting. So I thought it would just be a great place to impact students that needed it. And so that's why I thought, like, school psychology, that's a good place to see a lot of students and to help them is at the schools.
Yeah. Working as a school psychologist, you get a lot of insight into obviously all the different factors that go into student learning. And I know that now you specialize in learning disability and like kids with neurodivergence, autism, ADHD, those kinds of things. So can you tell us a little bit about what a school psychologist does in terms of those kids?
That's a great question. I think a lot of people don't know what a school psychologist is. I think even people that are teachers or that work in academic settings might have some confusion around it. So I'm really happy you asked that question. The most traditional way that people know about school psychologists, or the most traditional role that school psychologists often occupy, is the tester. Like if a student has been referred for an evaluation to see if they need a special learning plan or individualized education plan, an IEP, to meet their education needs, then a school psychologist is a big part of that testing process. Usually we test their cognitive ability, or their IQ is another way that people talk about that, their academic skills. Sometimes we assess social emotional skills, and then help determine what their needs are and if they do have a disability, or if they are eligible for that IEP is another way of thinking about it. So that's like kind of the most common thing we're known for. I think some people get confused, like, what's a school psychologist versus a school counselor, or a school psychologist versus a social worker? School psychologists really have a specialty in that testing piece. We also are trained to do social emotional interventions. So we could do, in some districts, school psychologists do social work minutes or counseling minutes, which is, I think, something that many school psychologists want to be doing more of. We don't want to be seen as just testers. That is kind of our most common role, though. And we know a lot about the systems. We know we get a lot of training in systems change and in systems development. So I think many of us get involved in, I don't want to make this like alphabet soup acronym world, but for people who know what response to intervention is, or the multi-tiered support system. So giving kids multiple levels of support based on their needs at the school setting, we love to get involved in that too. So really broad role, really different from school counselor or social worker, but I'm passionate about it. I think it's a role that we really need. And I think many districts are trying to really increase the number of school psychologists their districts have, so that their students can get more presence with the school psychologists, so they're not spread between 5 buildings as they have been historically.
I know I didn't even know we had a school psychologist until kind of going into the IEP meeting initially, the first one ever, because I think, at least in our district currently, it is sort of that more testing, evaluating role. And it would be great if parents knew that they were there as a potential resource or someone to check in with, occasionally. So it definitely an important role.
Yeah, I think more and more, the National Association of School Psychologists is definitely advocating for a smaller student to school psychologist ratio than what currently exists. And I think that's the right move. Mental health, we're realizing just how important it is. I think having one school psychologist per building would be great, because I think a big part of the problem, even special ed teachers not knowing about us, is because a lot of times we are in a couple buildings and we just show up for the meetings, and that's pretty much what we do, and that's too bad. I think we're capable of so much more than that. So
yeah. Yeah, I think a lot of the special education professionals are having the same trouble where, you're in one building, the OT's in another building, you never see each other, and how are you supposed to
Right.
build a working relationship based on that
Right. And
schedule?
that's so important to collaborate for student needs in that way.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah. Great, thank you. And you talked a little bit, or you sort of started to talk about this, but I know that at least when my son was diagnosed with autism, we got an educational diagnosis and a medical diagnosis and a couple of other kind of framed things.
mhm.
But can you talk a little bit for the parents? A lot of parents who are listening have children with some kind of something that would count as a learning or an educational challenge. So what's the difference between a learning disability like diagnosis compared to an autism or an ADHD evaluation where you go in and you get this, 10-page report on what's going on with your kid? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's kind of two questions folded in there, I think,
Mm-hmm.
or two distinctions that might help parents. One is there's the private route versus
Mm-hmm.
the educational route. So many parents do get evaluations that their insurance pays for, that they privately pay for. And a lot of times the words that come out of those evaluations are different from the words that an educational evaluation will use. For example, this is changing a little bit with the current DSM, and as that starts to kind of filter down into people's language. But for a long time, people used to say dyslexia
Mm-hmm.
and dysgraphia and dyscalculia too. So that's reading disability, learning disability in reading, learning disability in writing, learning disability in math. If you map the medical or the private diagnoses onto the educational diagnoses, those are the same. They're just different words, which I think is really confusing for people. Yeah, it's like, well, why does my student have dyslexia or do they have a learning disability? Like, what's the difference? That can be really confusing. So, I do talk to parents a lot that dyslexia is in the private world is a learning disability in reading or writing or writing really in the educational world. So sometimes the labels that kids get privately does not exactly map onto an educational diagnosis. So I think that's an important thing for parents to understand.
It's really good to know. Yeah.
Yeah. And then I think the other thing is kind of what's the difference in a school setting. So, if parents want to look into this, if you Google, and I don't know if you have show notes, we could share these in show notes,
absolutely.
but yeah, if they want to look at the IDEA or the Individuals with Disability Education Act, their labels, they can see all the different disability labels that IDEA has defined. And actually learning disability and autism are both in there.
Mm-hmm.
And the labels. ADHD is not in IDEA's disability categories. So if a student does have ADHD and does need an IEP, or they do need to qualify for services, then that has to be mapped somewhere else in those labels.
Gotcha.
So yes, often it goes in other health impairment, which is one of the labels. And sometimes it goes to emotional. The terminology that IDEA uses is actually emotional disturbance, which I find to be way too strong of
Not
language.
great. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm like, that's some school districts just kind of skirt past that and call it emotional disability, which is better. But actually in IDEA, it says emotional disturbance. I'm like, who is petitioning to change that language? Because we need to get right on that. But anyway, that's kind of the two places that ADHD gets mapped. Sometimes I think it more often gets mapped to other health impairment, but really essentially, I mean, technically the way I view it, at least, is that it's more about what services the kids are getting. So the educational diagnosis does matter. Obviously, you want your kid to have the accurate diagnosis because it's the language that people are going to be using when they talk about your child or your student, but it doesn't have to have a huge impact on the services that they get. Ultimately, a student with an autism diagnosis could get very similar services to a student with an ADHD diagnosis, which would again fall under probably other health impairment in school. So yeah, those services could look very similar with the same diagnosis because an IEP is always defined by the student's needs and not by the disability. So
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. And
yes. You're welcome. I'm glad.
So a parent going into a school system wanting services for their child is really looking for an educational diagnosis. It doesn't necessarily, is it true that they don't actually need a medical diagnosis to pursue that? But the medical diagnosis is just kind of supportive documentation, would you say?
Yeah, so every parent has a right to request an evaluation from their school, whether or not there's already a label of any kind. I think, and you do need to do that in writing. If you did suspect your student needed support at school through an IEP or even a 504 plan, which if we to just talk about that high level, IEP is usually services like social work or special ed minutes, and a 504 plan is usually like accommodations, like extended test time or extended, like turning in homework with an extended deadline, things like that. So if a parent did think their child needed those supports, they should request in writing an evaluation. And I would, just to make it simple, I guess I would give that to the principal or the school administrator. Ideally, you would give it to the school psychologist because they know most what to do with it, but it might be, you might not know who that person is. Mm-hmm. And they do need to respond to you. So, parents need to know that it's their right that they get a response to that request. The school doesn't have to agree to do it, but they do need to respond and tell you if they will or won't and why. So to go back and answer your question, knowing that information, essentially, if they already have an outside evaluation and diagnosis, that is more evidence that the school should do their own evaluation, but it's not necessary. If you want to request an evaluation without that and see what the school says, that's totally possible. And they might do it. And at that point, that's a free evaluation to you. It's paid by tax dollars to make sure that every kid gets a fair education. So that's kind of a nice benefit of that, as opposed to a private evaluation. It doesn't have any cost associated with it. So,
and having worked as a school psychologist for such a long time, do you have any sense of what kinds of support are most often offered by the school to a kid with autism or ADHD or any of that kind of broad spectrum of learning disability?
Sure. Yeah. So students with autism often have, as your listeners probably know, they often have social needs. They often have language needs, and they often have learning needs, not always. So students with autism, I would say often see a speech language pathologist at school. Their school does have those. Each school has at least one, who services students there. So providing speech language goals at their level, specifically for their needs, is one common service. Social workers also exist at every school. So providing social work minutes to help students with their social skills, again, at their level, help students, make transitions or any kind of social, emotional, or behavior goal would usually fall to the social worker. And then whatever academic goals they have, a lot of students with autism have average academic skills, a lot don't, so it just depends on what they need academically to be making progress towards grade level. And then ADHD, I'd say a big one again is with the social work, executive functioning goals, or learning to ask for a break if you need it. A lot of times students with ADHD and actually also with autism might have occupational therapy consult minutes or service minutes to be able to help with sensory processing, to be able to provide them with like fidgets or other things that they might need to be successful in their school environment from a sensory standpoint. That usually falls to the occupational therapist. Occupational therapists also sometimes work on like handwriting, like students with all three of these disabilities often struggle with fine motor skills. And so that would usually fall to the occupational therapist to work on those. And obviously, learning disabilities usually are some academic goals. So, if it's a reading disability, then often they're going to be working on decoding or reading comprehension or, spelling or writing skills. So those would all fall usually to the special education teacher. So there's a lot of services that are available, and it is specifically to the child and their needs, which is exciting.
That's great. Thank you. I think I've heard a lot of questions from parents who have listened to the podcast and are sort of trying to figure out, is this IEP actually useful, or like, what can I ask for, or what should I be asking for in addition to what maybe the school is offering? Because some teams are fantastic and some teams are overworked or overwhelmed and the IEPs aren't as great. So just getting the sort of gist of some of the things that are available potentially, I think is really helpful to folks. So thank you.
Great. Yeah, I think it's helpful to know I think it can be really overwhelming, that first meeting too, the evaluation meeting, you have all these people at the table and you're like, because you usually have the nurse, the social worker, the occupational therapist, the speech language pathologist, an administrator from the building, the school psychologist. It's very overwhelming. So it can be helpful to, it can be helpful to kind of know generally who might be there and help you kind of frame it for yourself too.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
And so we're talking about learning disabilities. There's a broad spectrum of things, of conditions, or of ways of learning that can be classified as learning disabilities. In your opinion, do you think there are limitations around our knowledge of learning disabilities, especially when it comes to this kind of in the school environment, I guess? Yeah.
I would say learning disabilities is the disability we have some of the least information or understanding of. Maybe information is the wrong way of saying it, but the least concrete understanding of. Like, I think for autism, for example, there's some pretty clear set, not that it's perfect, but some pretty clear criteria around socialization, communication. And though it is obviously a large spectrum, there is a lot of consistency in what we see in autism, for example. Yes. Learning disability is less consistent. And, as a school psychologist, we are actually trained in diagnosing learning disability sort of two different ways, which I think one way is just kind of very high level to talk about it. One way is looking at a discrepancy between a student's ability and their achievement, like so what they're capable of versus what they achieve. And another way is looking at how they respond to support. So if you give them support, is that enough to catch them up? If not, then maybe they have a learning disability, kind of to talk about it really simply, just to kind of understand globally, big, like kind of high level what we're talking about here. Yeah. Without like digging into the minutia. Yeah. So, so I guess I just say that to say, in my opinion, if we don't really know how to diagnose it, we're not really sure what it is. Like if there's not really consistent criteria about what defines it, a learning disability, then there's less consistency. Like I think with autism, we have it a lot more defined, and that leads directly to some treatments like visual schedules or structure or speech or social work. Whereas learning disabilities, it's a lot hazier. So yeah. I don't want parents to get too hung up on the disability label. Just make sure your kids are getting what they need. So if they're struggling with reading, pursue outside tutoring if you want, or make sure that they're getting, special education support at schools to get that help, and don't get too hung up or don't worry too much about the diagnosis, because we're still learning. We're still in process, just like our students are. We're still figuring out what exactly these things are, what to call them, what students' needs. And the point is really just to make sure students are getting what they need. So
yes, that's what we're hoping for. And so you as a tutor work one-on-one with folks all the time, and I assume are sort of highly specific in what you're offering each child, right? In a one-on-one service.
Yeah. So the way I kind of think of us is like a mini IEP, and people have,
less
I don't want
overwhelming.
people to, less overwhelming. Yeah, exactly. And some people have really negative experiences with their IEP teams. Yeah. And ours are certainly very different, but yeah, every parent we speak with, we try to get a really good idea of what their goals are, what their students' histories are, any diagnoses if they've got them, as specific as like what their grade level is and what their instructional level is. Like if they're not at grade level, where are they kind of operating in that grade level, or where are their skills at? And then we match the tutor specifically based on that. So some of our tutors specialize in reading, some specialize in math, some specialize in executive functioning skills, which are more like the organization, time management type skills, match specifically with what the student needs with what the tutor does and what they specialize in.
That sounds so helpful.
Good.
Can you tell us more about, for folks who are interested, where can they find more information on you and Progress Parade and kind of your work? And I will put some links in the show notes below, but.
Sure. Yeah, so they can visit us at progressparade.com, and there's all over that homepage, there's book a free consultation as you're scrolling down. If you click any of those book a free consultations, that comes to my calendar. So I do all of our initial consultations. I really want to make sure I'm understanding what their student needs, what the goals are, kind of all those things we just discussed, so that I can choose the best fit for them. And we do kind of custom match every single student that comes in with their perfect tutor who's trained for them. So they can definitely find us at progressparade.com and book a free consultation and talk more with me if they have any other questions or just want to discuss it a little bit.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Danielle.
To sort of wrap us up, is there anything you want to say to parents of disabled or neurodivergent students out there as they go through this kind of scary and overwhelming process of getting educated in the public school system?
Sure. I would say, you're in the right spot with a podcast like this. Self-knowledge and self-advocacy is so huge in special education. It's dealing with a school system, which is a massive bureaucracy, for better or for worse. And so keep, knowing your rights, and knowing, and having a community. So finding like-minded people who need similar things, like either through podcasts or Facebook groups or whatever, is going to go a long way towards you feeling supported, and you also having the knowledge that you need to support yourself and support your student.
So thank you so much. I appreciate you being here today.
It's been great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Neurodiverging is dedicated to helping neurodiverse folks find the resources we need to live better lives as individuals, and to further disability awareness and social justice efforts to improve all of our lives as part of the larger world community. If you're interested in learning more, please click the subscribe button to make sure you're notified when there's a new episode. Take a look around at previous podcast episode transcripts and give a listen at neurodiverging.com. Check us out on Patreon to support this podcast, and the blog at patreon.com/neurodiverging. Speaking of Patreon, thank you to all of my patrons. Thank you so much for supporting this episode of Neurodiverging. Transcripts and links are available at neurodiverging.com, and Laura Reber was our guest today, and you can find her and more information about supporting your student in the public school system at progressparade.com. See you next time. And remember, we are all in this together.